I think it's maybe appropriate to start with the fact that on this coffee table is a book called Wise Up by Guy Claxton. And it might be good to know that, or interesting to know that maybe our education systems might wise up. I was in a conversation with students at my university a week ago, and I made the comment that I can't help but think that maybe 10 years time from now we'll look back and think we might have been complicit in abusing children in the state of things that we're doing because we're creating so much angst, stress, and anxiety for our kids. It's a terrible predicament, I believe.
I think you're correct. I think it's a dangerous time in relation to early childhood education. I think we're looking at willingness to be able to not acknowledge the needs of the child because the institution itself is demanding something completely different. And we're focusing on the institution and not the child.
I go beyond just early childhood, but even in high school.
Yeah.
The performativity we ask of high school students, even from my own personal experience, the stress that my daughter went under to actually have to perform under the guise of achievement and some kind of abstract thing called an OP. And I've seen this with many kids, and I see this with kids coming into our university, where they come into the university and actually are doing less work, I suppose, than they did in high school, and they find it a sense of relief.
Yeah. And I see in every school I go to a kind of sadness. Children no longer enjoy, in early childhood, or indeed throughout the primary school, they no longer enjoy learning. It's all prescripted, and to make matters worse, we've robbed teachers of the joy. And it's a kind of grieving that I see in teachers because they sense that, you know, if I had my way, if I could be a professional, this wouldn't be happening like this.
I think the hardest thing, though, is seeing these young children come in and they've got such a skill set, they've got amazing ability to do things, and we have just stifled them. Now, with the push down of curriculum, where they're coming from, it's very difficult. So the pressure's on them from day one when they step into the classroom, and it's supposed to be the first start of their life, of a lifelong journey of engagement and enjoying everything, and all of a sudden the pressure's there and they have to perform from day one.
Yeah. I mean, as we go into the 21st century, you know, we're turning kids off wanting to learn from the day they walk into school with the conformist attitude that we've got. They need to be able to think and to advocate for themselves and to find who they are and where they belong and what their passion is and follow that path. Instead, we're telling them, no, you have to learn this now.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because there's something in that where we're actually teaching them how to be good students, not actually how to be good people or how to just learn. We're just teaching them how to learn to be a good student. That's a pretty big difference in the way the education system's running from what I remember it being run in the way.
It's very prescriptive.
Well, yeah, and that, you know, your focus was on learning how to be, a developing person in a community. That was a huge part of what schooling used to be about. And now the focus is absolutely, because of the data push, on being a good student, and that definition is very narrow.
Under the guise of performance.
Yep. Yeah.
And we talked earlier about it's now driven by fear.
Yeah.
And we don't have the conversations we need to have about children, about their developmental needs, and about their fit with curriculum. Indeed, we've heard people say, indeed, in coming into prep, some schools give a test.
Yeah, that's right.
We have an interview. So we're determining to what extent the child will fit the system rather than the other way around.
So comes a time there with a transition statement, and that is a big thing for us because we see these students, they have to fit in with this whole transition statement of where they're sitting that is shared with the school and the parent, but then it doesn't follow through. So, you know, that transition statement should be part of the assessment. Those teachers have taught those students that whole year, they know what's happening, and then that can't be shared or followed through either. And I think, Tom, you know a little bit more about the transition statement as well.
Well, I've probably given up reading a lot of that stuff because there's so much of a disconnect between the rhetoric coming out of the system and what's happening in classrooms. Indeed, it's been our experience, a couple of us recently, to find that in a conversation with senior officers, that they think this is happening in classrooms when we know it's the very antithesis of what is on their posters and in their statements and so on.
Well, your point on fear is an interesting one, because whenever we get some feedback, whether it be from the OECD or anything else, or our kids are falling behind, there's this fear factor. Suddenly we have to do something because it's this assumption we're not doing anything. And it becomes, again, a focus on performativity and data, when we should be looking at some of the cultural underpinnings of what it is we're trying to do with children. Like, what does education actually mean? Is it about ascribing a whole lot of tests so the kids show a particular frame or a particular mark? I think, if you look at philosophies of education, most educational philosophers say, well, that's really not what we're on about.
Which is where we were talking about the lack of that initial conversation about what does it mean, what does education mean in Australia. So without that initial conversation of being able to define what that means or discuss it even as a nation, which we've never done, all we've got left is data. All we've got left is what the outside is telling us to measure by or to decide by, because we don't know what to measure as a nation. We don't know what values we have around education or what matters to us. That's a big conversation.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're all data-driven, I know, but the data we don't want to look at is the number of children we're now suspending at prep, at year 1, at year 2, and the number of children who are swelling the ranks of the remedial classes, the interventions and so on by grade 3 and grade 4, and we wonder why we have so many behaviour problems in our schools. I'm old enough to remember when schools were really, sorry to get back to it, really joyful places. And my own children remember it that way, because they went to the school of which I was a principal. But we've moved right away from that, despite what we believe in.
No, what
in play-based curriculum back then, and as late as 2002, and we've abandoned it all because we've fallen for this. What Mike is getting at. I mean, when our Prime Minister said the rush is on, we've got to get this testing done because all the other nations around us are doing the same thing, and we don't want to be left out.
And what senior bureaucrats fail to realize is that education is not a sprint. It's more marathon than sprint, and it takes a long time. And we should be looking at how we enact change, and how we get the education system we want over an extended period of time, not as a soundbite based on some evidence that's come out of the test. And increasingly so, I've seen that every year since I've been in Australia, that the emphasis is now on data, who's doing what, and how do we fix it quickly, rather than looking at the whole education system and saying, as you said, what do we value? What is it that we want to see when children finish 13 years of education? Do we want them to be informed and active citizens, or do we want them to be young people who are so stressed and anxious that they can't even function in society? Which is we're seeing that more and more, and I think that's a tragedy in this country.
And will we be held accountable, dare I say, in the same way as the Catholic Church is now being held accountable? We're looking at child abuse. In terms of being an educator, I abhor the fact that the way we run our early childhood classes now actually corrupts learning dispositions. And we know that we create positive learning dispositions by the age of 8. It takes them all the way through to their adult life. So that's the cost.
The cost of a developmentally inappropriate curriculum.
Yeah, and a curriculum that doesn't acknowledge that there's aspects of things like literacy development that there's no question about it. We know that it develops an incremental process. You can't do anything to skip one. You just have to work through your development in relation to literacy understanding, and that the push to be able to start grading children against a grade benchmark on literacy development, rather than looking at that development of their literacy over time, and that the end goal is that they're literate. Not that we've told them from a really early age, you're bad at literacy, because we're actually grading you on something that is about you just developing and you just maturing. That's bizarre. That's a whole group of children who think that they are not good at reading or writing or not good at math, and it just means they took a little bit longer than everybody else to reach exactly the same milestone. It's not a good or bad thing. It's just the pace you need to actually reach that milestone.
So why were we so compliant? How come it was so easy to introduce grading into the early years of schooling?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think, again, it comes down to a quick fix. So, politicians operate on a soundbite. The federal electoral cycle is 3 years. So a report comes out saying we're not doing well. And so we try to find something that's quick and easy, or it appears easy, and puts pressure on children and teachers to demonstrate a quick transition from being, say, 14th in PISA findings internationally to being 13th or 12th or 10th for that matter. And the reality is that, a lot of people often often like to look at what Finland has done. And I'm a huge fan of what Finland has done, not because of where they land in PISA findings, but they took 20 plus years to do it because they knew they had to change everything they did. They wanted to change everything, their culture and the structures, so that the kids in Finland, aren't operating in any way like the kids in Australia. And they every year do better.
Yeah.
Every year. And why don't we look at that as a model and take that? I think probably because, sorry, I'm answering my own question, but I get frustrated by the fact that whenever we want to look at how do we improve education, we look at Finland, but we don't want to ask the hard questions like, how is it that Finnish kids never do any homework? And we hold it as a sacred cow, that if we don't do it, kids are going to be left behind. How is it that kids engage in schooling in a way that's so vastly different than our students, and yet they perform so much better, if you want to talk performance, and they look happy. They look like they actually enjoy being educated, for want of a better term. They enjoy learning.
The scary thing about the Finland model that worries me, though, is that the temptation is to go, oh, well, that works. Let's do that. Which is the same thing, which really it still comes back to that initial conversation about what do we as a nation think about homework, for example.
Oh, no question.
No
question. But I think the Finland framework is one that looks at it over a long period of time. So I don't think you can cherry pick what Finland does. You have to look at it in its entirety and say, this is how they achieved that. So they had an understanding of what they value as education. We have to find that. They have to have an understanding of what they don't value. We have to find that and stick to that. And it's based... That whole Finnish model is based on what's best for children developmentally, first and foremost. Nothing else. Not what's best on national benchmarks or international benchmarks.
Yeah. So where do children sit in Australia?
Yeah. So who best knows this?
Well, no. I mean, that worries me. You look at programs for principals conferences and so on, and you've got to look hard to find a program or an element in the program that's to do with kids. Be that stuff there to do with data, but not about the phenomenology of the modern childhood.
And I think principals have had a difficult task. I remember when the first implementation of the C2C came in and the Australian curriculum came in, there was a disconnect because the messages that came out of that were that the resource was the C2C and it was to marry in with the curriculum and the new Australian curriculum. And the messages that went back from that, what you're saying is, principals are so data driven, they've got so many different elements that they have to pull in for a school and make everything work, and their whole team of teachers work. Where does a child fit in that? They don't. And I think we devalue teachers, like with what's happening, as you're saying, it would be lovely to have a model, it'd be fantastic to have a model to go by, but I think we need to step up as a nation, statewide, and say, this is the model we're going to go by. At the moment, what I can see is we're still pulling on 150 years ago of education. We're still doing the same thing. We're still saying to our kids, you need to be cutting skills, you need to have handwriting skills. We've got kids now coming in technology, a lot of whole different skill sets. We need to embrace that. But we also need to support our teachers, give the teachers back the power in the classroom to provide the curriculum that they have the resources for. They have been in early childhood for a very long time, and get some of these senior teachers to come into early childhood and see what's happening. We were all kids once. We all have come from totally different, levels of where we stepped into education, but I think it's really important that a message gets out that we've got to start somewhere and we've got to start it. And how we do that, I don't know, but I think...
I was going to say that I think one of the biggest things in terms of that message is that message has to come from teachers and people in the field, not politicians. Politicians blur the message. And sadly, parents actually grab onto some of those things that the politicians are saying and think, well, that's what has to happen. And they put pressure on principals and teachers. I think we have to be advocates for informing parents about what does good education, what does good learning look like with children? What does sound learning look like? What does learning that's appropriate for children look like? Not what's learning that's appropriate for gathering data and making some kind of, and having bar graphs, which is just antithetical to what we know about how children grow, develop, and learn.
And there's enough evidence out there now that there's this growing anxiety in our schools.
With everybody in the school.
And it's paradoxical, isn't it? The places that should be places of joy and learning and so on are anything but.
Community.
And I'm a little bit concerned about the Principals Association in this country because they're placing a great deal of importance upon the study of the pressure on the principal at the moment. Professor Riley. And that's all well, and the attrition rate of teachers. And I'm uncomfortable about that because I think the light is being shone on the wrong place. If we can bring it back to the children and the state that they're in and their levels of anxiety and do something about that, we'd be doing something about for the whole school community, and the principals wouldn't have this ridiculous job that they have now. That's an undoable job.
What I think the politicians and the data misses is that we're talking about human development. We're not talking about things that can be measured with a number.
Yeah.
We need to look at the fact that teachers are people. Children are people, and we need to value those things. The most important thing that a prep child needs to learn is how to regulate their emotions and engage in a community of people.
Yeah.
It's one of the things, most teachers that I know, and I mean, in a past life I was in the classroom like many people here, and one thing I always remembered is that you never see the outcome of what you do in a year or 2 years. You see the outcome 15 years down the track when they bump into you somewhere and they say, I remember being in your classroom. I really enjoyed being there, or whatever that is. I mean, as people, as young adults going on in society. And I think we lose that in the sense that we somehow have to see this result, at incremental points. Yeah. And it's a ridiculous notion because, as you say, they're people, and it's a long-term process. I mean, I keep coming to that, but I just get a little bit tired of this sort of fast food education where we're just going to try and wrap everything up as quickly as possible, have kids digest it, and suddenly they're going to be better. And it's just simple.
And we can fix things quickly if we'll give them some medication.
That's right.
And what worries me,
that's a bigger
recently, the number of ADHD children now identified. I wonder how much that has to do with the fact that, particularly for boys, you're sitting there and you're sitting there. And then you start doing the things that your body wants to do, but the curriculum doesn't allow you to do it. And so parents become more stressed, got to get this kid off to a doctor and get some medication. And
do you know, in relation to ADHD, the other thing, it supports the notion of the lack of joy too.
Yeah.
Because executive function needs dopamine. And if you don't have any opportunity to be able to have joy in your day, no point of connection, your brain's not going to be able to produce any kind of chemicals to keep your body under control.
And you know what I'd like to see captured on film is a lower school class, prep 1 or 2, and they're doing their pencil and paper stuff, and then they get a chance to be creative with something. You have a look at the transformation in their faces and their bodies, and off they go.
Focus.
And their language changes at that point as well.
Well, what the benchmarks miss is
it's hard to benchmark creativity.
You can't benchmark creativity, and they're missing the fact. What the benchmarks are missing, this is what I was going to say, is readiness.
Yes.
Well, so
and it's unique to each and every child. You can't say this child at this age will be doing this. That's not something you can do.
And it's so prescriptive, and how it is, it's how teachers sort of take that message or that information and then transport it into what they're supposed to be doing or what is expected of them.
And parents say, my child hasn't reached this benchmark. Oh my God,
terrified.
And the fear is fueled by the political attitudes towards it.
So the anxiety cycle deepens. But how do we? I think we agree that it's the political drivers that are causing this mess. So what levers do you pull to change that? They'll only go back to data. When I started teaching, readiness was a big thing. I understood that the kid had to be, had to have some measure of or level of auditory discrimination, and that there would be a range of that in the 4, 5 and 6 year old. Now what do we want to do? We want to give every child in year 1 a phonics test, even when we know some of those children are going to have trouble discriminating in those sounds. But we're going to do it anyway.
And there's nothing wrong with them.
And there's another phony message.
They're just not ready.
Not ready. Well, where's readiness gone?
And they're working on something else right now.
So the notions of readiness, I mean, you mentioned ADHD, you mentioned readiness. I mean, there's a phenomenal study by a gentleman in Western Australia that came out and found a correlation between when you enter boys in school and diagnoses of ADHD. I mean, the younger they were, the more likely it was they would be diagnosed with ADHD. And he was on he was on ABC, and he was talking about this, and now it's just kind of disappeared by the wayside. And that is the data that we should be talking about. That is the research we should be talking about. How is it that boys, in particular, have this incremental notion of ADHD, and it's tied to when they enter school. So the older they are, the less likely they are to be diagnosed. I think that speaks volumes about what we do with kids and how we determine readiness or think of readiness. Readiness isn't something you put in a framework and say, okay, as you say, we're going to test their phonics to see if they're right. No, readiness is distinctly individualistic by its very nature, and particularly in those early years. In those early years, it's so very important to understand what are children ready to do.
So it is a question about a national conversation about what we want from schooling, and also what we believe to be about children and childhood, and get some consensus around that. Well,
I think that's the foundation. I think before you talk about what we want from schooling, it's a notion of what do we understand children to be. I mean, even today, in educational faculties around this country and around the world, when students study things like developmental psychology, educational psychology, they go back to the very people who really understood. We talk about Piaget. He had a really good understanding of what kids should and shouldn't be able to do. We talk about Vygotsky. We talk about Bronfenbrenner. We talk about Montessori. We talk about all of these. And there's a reason we do. It's because everything they came up with tells exactly what kids should be able to do. And that needs to be part of the conversation, not what the OECD does with PISA, and not what we think NAPLAN does. That has to be the foundation, and then we can decide what should school look like, from my perspective, to meet the needs of those kids.
But we were doing that, weren't we? We had preschool that was just unbelievable, especially in Queensland, how we were doing everything. The rollout of prep, when prep came in. That first year of prep was fantastic. Everything just changed.
Can I just jump in and say, let's get rid of that word prep to begin with, because it has a connotation with preparing for everyone. Let's get rid of it. Let's use Frederick Froebel. Let's call it kindergarten. I know it might be stepping on other people's toes, but it's the children's garden. You call it prep, and you have this notion that somehow we've got to get kids ready, and that in itself is problematic.
And I think that was another message from the department as well. What do we call it? Like, even the word play, still play has a massive,
It's become a pejorative. It's like somehow play something that happens all the hard work is done.
I'm wondering how much of this actually comes back to a funding model that requires 12 years of learning and no more. Like fundamentally, because you can't wait. No one wants to be able to keep a child at a level anymore. You just want to keep propelling them through no matter whether they've got any readiness. It'd be interesting to know if there was a piece of research done at some point about 15 years ago that said, how we could save a lot of money, enforce 12 years, never go beyond. That would explain a whole bunch of things in relation to never pause, just keep propelling. Because if we just changed it so that, you sat NAPLAN when you were actually at grade 3, not just by age, when you were actually reaching those outcomes and you're ready to sit it, that you did it then, that would have a pretty profound effect on how data is used and how we experience it.
But when are we going to count the costs? Count the costs of mental health in children and the exclusion suspension rates? The support we have to provide them, which we wouldn't need to provide them if we got it right to begin with.
That's right.
So maybe that's how we get into the politician's mind, will show them the costs that they're not counting. We can say to them, you're only allowed 24 semesters of schooling. That's a good way to put the limits on it. But we pay later, don't we? We pay in terms of bad health. We pay in terms of incarceration and so on.
I guess that comes back to what I said initially when we started this conversation. In 10 years' time, we might have that data that says what we did 10 years ago was so fundamentally problematic and complicit in some notion of child abuse, because we took children and we engaged in things they weren't ready for, and we put all kinds of pressure on children and parents, but children in particular. So now at 15, 16, 18, 20, they have severe anxiety and mental health issues. And that is something that costs, if I want to be a politician long term, that is something that has a huge impact on your economy, and we're seeing that. So, and even again, we talk about organizations. 2015, the World Health Organization identified that by 2015, the number one cause of death on this planet will be stress-related illness. I mean, that speaks volumes. How is that, and why do we have children who have anxiety and stress? And if you sense a degree of angst and passions, because I'm deeply concerned with the anxiety I see in kids today when they go to school. I have not experienced that in my professional career on 3 continents, and as a student myself, and I see children who are at school who have unbelievable anxiety manifest in many different ways, and I think that's hugely problematic.
It's lucky we live in a democracy, so really the decision to be able to challenge all of these things comes back to us as individuals in the democracy. If we want to be able to say to the government that this kind of process isn't one that we want, and we want it to be different, and we know that there's an alternative to this that we could actually be focusing upon, as individual citizens, that's where you actually need to step up and say something.
And teachers need to be empowered. They need to have they've got the ability, they just need to have that understanding that they have a voice, and if they have a collective voice, and if they don't voice their opinions, the politicians aren't going to get it. You touched on politicians before, and probably don't get me started, because, you know, we need people in there that understand the education system. We need, as we talked earlier, people. You don't have someone that does your brain if they don't know anything about it. And this is the problem. We get portfolios that get taken over with politicians that don't know anything from the ground roots.
Yeah.
So.
But that fear is stifling the voice, though, isn't it? I wonder why Queensland Teachers Union isn't saying something about the condition of their workforce, their members.
I mean, but it's so held in fear. I mean, as a parent, several years back now, when we were still in a mainstream school, even though you knew to a certain degree that the teachers weren't happy, they could never say it to you. There's this code of conduct that teachers are not allowed to voice their opinions.
Yes.
And it's not till I was out of that system that you start realising that they do get it. The teachers get it. But they can't say it to you as a parent in that school.
I tell you who else gets it, and they're another quiet observer. And that is teacher aides. And I've been in the job long enough to know or to meet people that I worked with 20 years ago, and they'll tell me about their teachers that they're working with now, and they say things like they've become robots. Every step of their day is determined by some other process or person, and they just roll on through it. You try relieving a teacher for even a couple of sessions, there's this pressure to get through what that teacher wants done, and so you do it, and it's not helping the kids at all.
And I think not having the same teacher aide in the classroom to support those children, those hours have been taken away from them, like they don't have the support. One teacher in a classroom of 28 children, especially Lily's, is quite difficult. You've got so many dynamics, you've got so many, as you talked about, ADHD, lots of other issues that are happening, and a classroom with children that young need that support.
Yeah, and not only half an hour here and there, they need a teacher aide that knows them.
Correct.
They need that relationship.
And I've worked with some fabulous teacher aides, that should have been teachers.
Yeah.
It comes back to what you were saying about what do we value. I mean, if you think about that, then why not take the millions of dollars that are expended in an industry now called NAPLAN and embed that in resourcing teachers and schools in a way that's actually going to find some benefit. I mean, it's a multi-million-dollar industry now.
Yeah.
And it's not just in schools, but you can buy NAPLAN resources in most places. And the federal government spends millions in doing this, so they can have a website called My School. Let's get rid of that altogether. Let's take that money and talk about the values of education and bring back the joy.
Good. Our conversation's about to wind up, and I wouldn't want it to finish on that dirty word. So we're trying to express some optimism somehow?
I think so. I think, well, the most optimistic thing is increasingly I see people are very passionate about doing what's best for children. Yeah. And maybe one day we'll look at something, we can do something called the joy of schooling,
yes.
And that would be a monumental step in the right direction. But we have to start somewhere, and I think, I'm in the business now of working with future teachers, and what I find, I've never come across a teacher or a future teacher that went into the business, first of all, for money, because that's they come in because they want to make a difference, and they love kids. And I think that's so fundamentally important. We have the people in the places that we need there. We just have to support them. And we have to send that message to parents as well, and to politicians, say, they know what to do. We will help them do it. Let's just get on with understanding what education should be.
And give the teacher the power of the curriculum. Let them take back the curriculum and ownership of it and educate children.
So we're looking at, dare I say, liberation theory. We've got to free up a whole lot of people in this system. Yeah. So is that the point at which we can conclude this segment?
I believe so.
We